NEPAD and to the African Union. African Union and NEPAD are useful institutions. What linkages do you have with organizations such as AGRA? What components of your budget find their way to AGRA, so that ultimately AGRA can be an organization that feeds from the breast of Africa? This is the question that African Union must ask. This is the question that NEPAD must ask. And if you ask these questions and answer them boldly, I have no doubt in my mind, African Union, that Africa will realize her Agenda 2063. Permit me to stop there. Thank you. The laws were informed by policy, law, and then implementation. That hierarchy, that you had to have a policy position. And many countries had these. Of course, we think that they are now new. Now that we talk of vision, we do not know that in fact, in the first 5 years of our independence, each country was driven by some vision and some policy, and that law was distilled from those policy and strategic positions. We've now become so tactical in our solution to things that we've forgotten that there is a strategic agenda. We have tactical positions, which, as you know, you who are experts here, you've got to have a strategic direction. You may change your tactics, but the strategy, the overarching strategy, remains undisturbed. And this is what calls into question the whole question of governance in Africa. And governance must be understood at different levels. You talk about the political governance, which informs governance in the sector, in the different sectors. In agriculture, if you look at Kenya, for example, we have all these laws that have been made to deal with the coffee sector, with the tea sector, with the sugar sector. And then, of course, recently we also have these regional protocols. In East African Community, we have them. In SADC, you have them. Then in ECOWAS, you have them. In Central Africa, you have them. And lack of harmony in some of these things. And part of it, of course, is not just disharmony in Africa, but through bilateral and multilateral treaties. So Africa must also have a clarity of some of the things that we get into. You, as East Africa, you have a position. Let me take, for example, the position that Kenya has adopted about GMOs. We have a country position on this. What is the East African position on this? Is there a uniform understanding of it? And I think these are the things that we must talk about now that we have agreed that we are moving block by block East African community. I was talking to some East African parliamentarians, and I was telling them that, you see, if we want to move as East Africa on the critical issues that define Africa and define us, we must have one common position that defines how we engage with others, so that once East Africa has entered into this position, if it is in the area of agriculture, then we have one common position that we used to deal with the Chinese. Just to veer off a little, we are now importing fish from China. What is the position? What is the East African position? Kenya is doing it. Does Uganda think it is right? Does Rwanda think it is right? Burundi, South Sudan? So lack of clarity. And I said, to the anger of my audience at one time, and I was rather uncharitable, that the problem with Africa is that those who have ideas have no power, and those with power have no ideas. And that in many ways still informs. So you have all these ideas on how we can green Africa. I listen to you and I can see you are bubbling with ideas, but you don't have the power. And the fellow with power has completely no idea. And yet somehow, and this I think is your problem, when the electorate is given the choice between you with ideas and the one without ideas, the Africans' affinity for people without ideas is amazing.
Thank you.
It's amazing. And just to give you an idea of how, and permit me to give the credit to your President Paul Kagame, that you can see that there are certain areas in sector, if you go to the livestock sector, for example, the intervention of the Rwandese government is sensitive to the realities of the Rwandese household. And they may have their problems, and problems will always be there, but there is a sense in which if you ask an average Rwandese whether the government has got it right, they'll say they have it right, which is a good thing. If you look at our government, Kenyan government position on coffee, and you ask your typical coffee grower or tea grower whether our government has got it right, they tell you they don't have an idea. And that is why they are uprooting coffee. So there is a sense in which the government's involvement is quite clear. And that is how I understand the Cameroonian problem with President Biya. There is a sense in which there's... I don't know how to be polite about this. I'm trying to look for a word about it. There is a sense in which ideas get frozen. You get people in government so that governmental positions are given because people are rewarded rather than people with passion. If you look at the early movement in Africa, the first 5 years in many African countries, the men and women who were given positions in government had some zeal of a missionary kind. If they were in agriculture, there is a sense in which you could see the drive, my people must be liberated from hunger. If you see the education, if you see health, and in some countries it is in fact the institutions and structures which were built in that era that are still alive and well, including the legal infrastructure. But unfortunately that disappeared. And how do we repair it? I think that there is a sense in which an institution such as the African Union can do it. And why I say African Union can do it is that African Union can do it because it is a continental body with a larger agenda. And I hope now that with the proposal African Union has made about, is it some tax that you want, is it a proposed that tax? Because part of your problem is that you have many ideas, but you have no funds. Because if you have an idea and then you depend on a Western NGO to fund your agenda, they are not interested. They do what is in their best interest, and I don't quarrel with them. He who pays the piper must necessarily call the tune. So the day Africa begins to deploy our own resources and understand that agriculture is at the very heart of it, we must ask ourselves, for example, and my good friend from Nigeria must ask, if you go to your typical West African breakfast table, butter will be from Denmark, skimmed milk will be from Switzerland, possibly eggs from Romania or from the United Kingdom, ketchup from the United States, chilies from Portugal, so that effectively you can see, and you talked about agribusiness. If we could ensure that there are these linkages in markets so that the farmer, right now I belong to some group and I see somebody say, had a lot of mangoes, but the mangoes are rotten. So that there are those who have there is a surplus of an item, yet there is a shortage of it in one area. And I think that this is something that must be done, and I think the African Union can achieve it. So linkages between AGRA and African Union and ECOWAS and SADC and EAC cannot indeed be underrated. And of course, the question that was asked from Ethiopia, there is this argument that is now alive and well, whether Africa does not need benevolent dictators. And there is argument that is normally put forth, they cite Lee Kuan Yew and little Singapore, which is a city-state, and I told them that there is a sense in which the ideas are good, but the solution of Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore will not quite work in Democratic Republic of Congo. but there are ideas that can't be borrowed. But I still believe that a democratic dispensation is capable of delivering these things. And once again, one looks at Ethiopia. Ethiopia, a population of nearly 90 million, slowly released.
I apologize, but I had to stop this and put in my 2 cents. This is how I run this channel, so get used to my 2 cents. If you don't like it, it's time to skip. But I will continue to play the video after I add in my 2 cents. But something he said is very striking, and it's so true. I myself have never thought about it, but this message is a rude awakening for even me. He said, if you look at a typical African breakfast table, milk, eggs, butter, and whatever else we may eat, cereal, whether it be oatmeal or what's that other cereal that we usually eat in Africa? Not farina, what is it? Cream of wheat. Those are stuff we eat as a common breakfast. I mean, we do have typical African breakfast, but we're talking about those Africans who feel they have become modernized and they are civilized and they are westernized, that want to eat more of a westernized breakfast. And I'm not knocking Western breakfast. I just want to make a point. It is time now for us Africans, whether you're in America, in the UK, in the diaspora, or you're in Africa, when you sit down to have a breakfast, but especially in Africa, this is really for Africa, and you sit down to have your typical westernized or Americanized or Europeanized or civilized, as we call it, breakfast. There should be no such thing as civilized or uncivilized breakfast. But anyway, just for the sake of making my point, let's stick with that word, use that terminology for now. And you sit to eat, it is time for us to begin to look at all of the items that we're using on the table for breakfast or lunch or dinner. Where were they manufactured? Where were they made? And why are we not asking questions? We just become this generation of consumers without producing anything, and we could care less. Because when people produce your food, they literally have your life in their hands. And this is why you see so many starvation in Africa. And when the continent of Africa has so much land and water and greenest pasture, not only to grow her own food, but even to supply and export food to the world, we are dying of starvation because we are importing coffee. We are importing tilapia that's grown in China. We have so many lakes and rivers all over Africa. Rice, we're importing rice from China and Japan when we have land, massive land. This is insanity of the highest order. I hope not only our leaders will wake up, but a new generation of Africans leaders will begin to wake up and question these things and look for a solution to these questions, because this can no longer continue to go on. Not on our watch and not on our shift. You sit down from today forward, whether you're an African in Africa or in the diaspora, you eat your typical breakfast or lunch or dinner. Look at all the products that's on your table. Where were they manufactured? Where were they made? Where were they produced? And why aren't they produced in Africa? It is time for us to begin to see made in Africa, made in Liberia, made in Nigeria, made in Botswana, made in Cameroon. Just so we can see made in China, made in America, made in the UK, made in Indonesia. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it's time for us to see made in Africa. I know Africa is a continent. But made in Cameroon, made in Zimbabwe, made in Mozambique, made in Kenya, Ghana, Ethiopia, Liberia. It's time for us to see those. Can you imagine how proud that would make you feel as an African or an American? Wherever you are, when you see a product made in your country, and we don't just want made in Africa or made in Liberia, just to say we have that sense of we're proud that we made something. We want something of quality, not quantity. Something of quality, something of substance, something that is strong and durable that can last through the years. Whether it be a t-shirt or a cup or a mug. There's even a manufacturing plant in Africa. And the cars and the technologies and the computers and the bombs and all the militaries, all of those things that were made, the raw materials came from Africa, but yet we don't have one manufacturing plant in the continent. It is an embarrassment. It's a disgrace. It's a shame. It's a reproach. And yet our crooked and evil and wicked and heartless, selfish, self-centered, self-focused, egotistical, narcissistic leaders could care less. There's a new breed of Africans rising up. These leaders in power now, they will either have to change or bow and get out of the office. That's it.